Good afternoon, everyone. We welcome you to this webinar titled SARS COVID-2 from the patient to lab overview of the diagnostic essentials. As you know, all of us, have seen this, witnessed this, how COVID has exposed cracks in the healthcare system at different areas, and the diagnostic area is also not very untouched. And over a period of time, we see that there are different guidelines, different news of different drugs which are being tried, and we still are still some distance away from effective vaccine also. So similarly on the diagnostic side, there are some guidelines on testing and reporting, etc. So today we are fortunate to have Dr. Simantini Banerjee, who is going to give us insights on this area when we are looking at the diagnostic space and dealing with this pandemic, this particular topic when you're looking at these patients. So before we request Dr. Simantini to come and talk about the topic, I would like to introduce her to all of you. So Dr. Simantini Banerjee is a clinical microbiologist and infectious disease specialist by profession. She completed her medical graduation from the prestigious Calcutta Medical College. This was followed by her specialization degree in clinical microbiology and infectious disease from Burdwan Medical College. After completing her specialization, she has worked for several years as a consultant in both the private sector as well as the government sector. Currently, she is attached with the ESI, PGI MSR and Hospital, Maniktala, where she serves as a member of molecular lab and specialist medical officer in clinical microbiology and infection control. So we are very happy to have Dr. Banerjee speak on this topic and to give us insights on what's happening in this space so that we all are benefited from this discussion. So over to you, ma'am.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Adijit, for the lovely introduction. And a very big thank you to Polymed for organizing this webinar and giving me this wonderful opportunity to interact with all of you. I welcome all participants, all my friends, colleagues, juniors, my esteemed seniors. Today's discussion will be on the topic which is actually eating our heads for the last 6 or 7 months, that is COVID-19. Since that is a very topic, being a microbiologist, today mainly discuss I will basically discuss the diagnostic criteria, who are the target population under risk, how to collect the sample, from whom to collect the sample, and finally, how to process it in the lab so that we can get a definitive results. Initially, I would just like to give you a short introduction. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course also known as the coronavirus pandemic, as we all know, is caused by the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus. Now, what is a pandemic? What is a pandemic? Basically, when a particular infectious disease occurs in such a large number that it exceeds the expected level in a certain population, and it transcends even international barriers, then it can be referred to as a pandemic. The first case was probably the index case, that is, was decided to be on 1st December in Wuhan district of China in December 2019. There was also quite a few clusters of unidentified pneumonia patients who were later identified with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Finally, the World Health Organization, that is the WHO, declared it a public health emergency of international concern on 30th January 2020, and then finally a pandemic on 11th March 2020. So since it's just been a few months, but within 3 to 4 months, today we are on 19th of June. Now we have more than 8.53 million cases of COVID-19 worldwide, with more than 454,000 deaths, although approximately 4.5 million people have recovered. India started showing the peak rather late. Initially, it was gradually spreading from China through Russia to the European subcontinent and the North America. And India came in its share of infectivity rather late. Maybe the peak started increasing from April onwards. As of June, India has approximately 3.8 lakh cases with over 12,000 deaths and 2 lakh recoveries. However, active number of cases are 1.55 plus still. Now, what I would like to say is that this disease is comparatively a newborn disease. So not really much confirmed data or studies is available regarding its natural history. There has been a suggestion, some studies have found out that the SARS-CoV-2 virus strain is very closely linked to the bat coronavirus and to the pangolin coronavirus. So there is always a theory that the natural reservoir of the SARS-CoV-2 virus might be bats or pangolin, but it has not been confirmed till date. Next, on to the mode of transmission. I think this is a very much advertised and publicized point. All of us already know the term social distancing has become synonymous with our lives nowadays. So the WHO recommends at least 1 meter, that is 3 feet distance from another person to avoid acquiring infection, whereas the CDC USA recommends 2 meters, that is 6 feet distance for safety. As we can see in this, just a minute. We can see in this diagram, you can see the infected lady is standing with 2 men. The one who is in close contact is at high chance of acquiring droplets bearing the virus. This is because the main mode of transmission of coronavirus is via droplets, which are basically tiny molecules of maybe nasal or oral secretions, mucus secretions, which are actually carrying the virus. You can see a highly magnified electron microscopic pictures of the same, which is below. So any person who is very close to another infected person can inhale those droplets, and unknowingly the viral load, which is capable of causing infection, will enter into his body. On the other hand, a person, if you see the man on the right side, who is maintaining an adequate social distance, is unlikely to be infected. This is the reason why the term social distancing is being given so much of importance. While we are discussing this, I would also definitely want to mention that the virus can spread through the touch of contaminated surfaces. That is a secondary spread, but definitely the incidence is much less. And of course, being a healthcare worker myself, I must say that there are certain invasive protocols such as maybe laryngoscopy, endotracheal intubation, even a particular sample collection. When a person is collecting a nasopharyngeal or an oropharyngeal swab, there is a very high chance that the patient might sneeze or cough and thus give a very hefty dose of virus onto the collector's face. So these are all the methods through which usually the virus spreads. Now, a brief run through the general virology and the morphology of the coronavirus. It is a novel virus, not previously detected before. The kingdom it belongs to is Ortho-RNA viri. The family is Coronaviridae, genus Beta coronavirus, species severe acute respiratory syndrome related coronavirus. As we all know, similar viruses belonging to the same family had caused some infections. A few years back in 2003, there was another SARS corona outbreak causing acute respiratory tract infection and death of almost 8,000 people worldwide. And in 2011, there was a MARS outbreak, that is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. But this SARS-CoV-2, this is a novel virus, and this was first detected, as we discussed already, in December. Now, if you look at the picture that is attached with the slide, this is a magnified picture taken by highly resolution electron microscopy. And it shows that the virus, it is one of the largest RNA virus that is present. It is a positive sense single-stranded RNA virus. It is an enveloped virus and has a nucleocapsid. If we know the morphology of a virus, any virus usually consists of a genetic material within and has surrounding a nucleocapsid. This has a helical symmetry nucleocapsid, and furthermore, there is an envelope. But why the name corona? This is because this virus has some protein spikes. As you can see in the picture, these are knob-like structures which project from the surface of the virus molecule. Just like when we were children, we used to draw the picture of a sun, and it used to have the rays of sunshine coming out. So similar to a solar corona, this also resembles a corona, and hence the name has been given a coronavirus. So this was just a brief introduction. I think that now we will move on to today's lecture. So today's discussion, I think we can broadly divide into three parts. One, the testing criteria, that is whom to collect and when to collect. Number two, the process of sample collection and transport to the designated laboratory. And number three, the actual diagnostic protocols that are being followed in the lab or which are in the pipeline for the immediate future. So the first one is the whom to collect, that is the testing criteria. See, under all the patients who are to be tested, we will roughly divide them into two broad classifications, the symptomatic cases and the asymptomatic cases. Now, within the symptomatic cases, WHO has given two very broad definitions. One is SARI, that is not the dress which is worn by Indian women, but the full form of SARI is severe acute respiratory infection. It has been defined as an acute respiratory infection with a history of fever and temperature of greater than equal to 38 degrees Celsius, cough, which has been seen an onset within the last 10 days and which requires hospitalization. Please see the last line. This is the defining factor which differentiates the case of SARI from a case of ILI. So what is an ILI? An ILI is an influenza-like illness. WHO defines an ILI again as an acute respiratory tract infection with a temperature greater than equal to 38 degrees Celsius, cough, onset within the last 10 days, but which does not require hospitalization. Apart from this, ICMR has also given an exhaustive list of almost 13 symptoms, clinical symptoms, which should raise the suspicion in either the attending doctors or the immediate family members that this person might be infected and might need to get tested. What are these symptoms? At present, there are 13 symptoms. These include fever, cough, expectoration, then malaise, loss of sensation of taste and smell. This was previously not there. This has recently been included, I think, around about a week or so back. Then hemoptysis, excessive expectoration, abdominal pain, chest pain, shortness of breath, etc. So in all these cases, for SARI, for ILI, for the symptomatic patients, the thumb rule is the testing should be done ASAP, that is as soon as possible. In fact, since the average, the median incubation period of COVID is only 5 to 6 days, although it can range from 2 to 12 days, the mean or the median incubation period is 5 to 6 days. So of course, we should always be in a hurry and get these patients tested as soon as possible. So the next step is the asymptomatic patients. These are the people who are not showing the clinical features suggestive of COVID-19. However, they might still be carrying the virus. In fact, a large percentage of the Indian population, it is being seen, is asymptomatic positive. So ICMR has issued the following advisory. Here, I would like to just say that every state government has its own individual criteria or rules that it follows. So whatever I'm saying, it might not match with another state government, or it might be varying from one place to another, or it might even keep on changing. It's a variable thing. First and foremost, of course, if there is any history of international travel for the last 14 days. Now, of course, since India has been in a lockdown for the last 3 months, this is not really a very materialistic factor. But since this is in the advisory, I have mentioned this. Then if there has been any interstate travel. Now, interstate travel is a very, very important issue, considering in mind that there was such a lot of hue and cry over the migrant laborers. So in this case, the testing should be done within day 5 and day 10. Next are those who are the direct contact of a laboratory confirmed case of COVID. Again, in all states may not follow this. In many places, they are merely the high risk or the direct contact people are put in containment zones or into quarantine. They are not tested, while some states prefer to go for testing of all the direct contacts as well. Last but not the least are the healthcare workers and all other essential workers who have been exposed unknowingly without adequate protective gear to a confirmed positive cases. So in all these cases, it is mandatory that within day 5 to day 10, testing is done, and even if the history of the patient is showing all this, then it makes it all the more urgent that the testing should be done. Okay, so now we know whom to collect and when to collect. We can go to the next part, that is the actual sample collections. Just a brief review of the samples which can be or should be collected. These include nasopharyngeal swab and oropharyngeal swabs. These have been recommended both by CDC as well as by WHO. The bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, endotracheal aspirate or wash, sputum, tissue from biopsy or autopsy, including lung tissue, and serum. If serum is the sample, then there must be paired serum samples. That is, 2 samples, one taken during the acute clinical phase and one taken when the patient is in the convalescent phase, that is the recovering phase. Okay, so I will just give you a brief idea into the sample collection methods. I think if I keep the picture open, the diagram open, it will be of greater help. So initially what we get a COVID-19 collection kit. This usually contain a nasopharyngeal flexible thin swab made of swab stick that is made of Dacron or flocked polyester, and there's a viral transport medium vial. There is some absorbent material, there is a Ziploc bag, there is some ice gel, and of course there is a requisition form which has been approved by the ICMR or whatever the accredited governing body of that particular country is. So how do we collect a nasopharyngeal swab? In order to collect a nasopharyngeal swab, first and foremost, the collector should be adequately protected with a PPE, that is a personal protective gear. He or she should then ask the patient to gently blow his nose so that thick mucus or any obstruction is revealed. Then most important, the nasopharyngeal swab stick should be inserted through the anterior nares, along the base of the nose, parallel to the hard palate. There is a very wrong concept which is done by many people, that the swab stick has to be inserted in a vertical direction. But this is not the case. If you do that, you're more likely to hit the nasal turbinates and you are likely to affect the dangerous area of the nose, which will result in a bout of epistaxis. What you should do, you should move the nasopharyngeal swab stick parallel to the hard palate, that is in a backward fashion along the base of the nose until and unless you get some resistance, that is the nasopharyngeal wall. When you reach the nasopharyngeal wall, let the swab be in place for a few seconds so that it can absorb the secretions, and then slowly rotating the swab stick, withdraw it gently, immediately put it into the VTM vial, snap it off, there's a flexible joint, and screw cap the top of the VTM vial back. You should take care that the entire tip of the swab stick, which has got the actual sample, should be completely immersed into the viral transport medium. So the nasopharyngeal sample is a very, very important sample, and it depends a lot on the expertise of the person who is collecting the sample. The next one is the oropharyngeal sample. I will just give you the picture again. This is comparatively easier. If you see the picture on the right, you ask the patient to open his mouth wide, and without touching the tongue or the buccal mucosa, you have to touch the posterior pharyngeal wall and rub the swab stick on the tonsillar fossa. Then withdraw it carefully again without touching the tongue. A word of caution, the patient might have his gag reflex activated and might have an involuntary coughing or vomiting, gagging action. So wearing of PPE, proper face shield, proper mask is always mandatory to avoid cross-infection. After the oropharyngeal swab is collected, in the same way it should be put inside the VTM and sealed. Now, for other samples like the BAL fluid, that is the bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, the endotracheal aspirate, sputum, these are all sealed in sterile container with proper labeling. I must mention that labeling is very important, and apart from the patient's name, it should include a particular ID. Usually nowadays, the government of India has started an SRF ID that must be present on either the VTM vial or the sterile container. If you are sending a biopsy or an autopsy sample, the sample is not to send the sample in a formalin. I have often seen that in many cases, histopathology maybe examination, and for even microbiological examinations, they send it in formalin. If you send it in formalin, no polymerase chain reaction or any microbiological examination can occur, not even a culture, because the genetic material, the bacteria, virus, whatever pathogen, has to remain alive. So please send it a normal saline. And if you are sending, excuse me, if you are sending a serum samples, they must come in serum separated tubes. 3 to 5 milliliter of whole blood sample is sufficient sample volume in case of adults. So that is sample collection. The next step is also equally important. That is the sample packing and transportation. I do have a picture over here, but I don't think it's very clear. So what I would like to do is I would like to, you can see the slide and I would like to explain that what we do first and foremost, once we have the viral transport media with both the nasopharyngeal and the oropharyngeal swab stick inside, we firmly cap the VTM. We ensure that proper labeling is done. Then ICMR has recommended to put paraffin around the cap of the vial to ensure that no spillage occurs. Now, I do understand that this might be very difficult because paraffin is not really very user-friendly. It is quite messy. In that case, you can use Parashield, you can use Leucoplast. I mean, whatever seems to you most stable, but ICMR recommends paraffin. Then wrap the viral transport media in cotton wool or any other absorbent material, because in case, in spite of all the precaution, if there is a spill, at least it will absorb the infected material. After that, put the wrapped thing into a plastic container. This need not be a very big container. It can be as small as a centrifuge tube, and close it and then put it inside a transparent Ziploc bag. Seal the Ziploc bag and make it airtight. Now this Ziploc bag, it will not measure very big. It will be around this size. Put that inside a second container. That also might be the size, you know, of the containers in which we keep the masala in the kitchen. That is fine. That's adequate enough. You put it inside that, you seal it, surrounded it with the ice gel packs or the frozen gel packs which are commercially available, and place it inside a thermocol box. Why thermocol? Because again, it's a bad conductor of heat. So inside the thermocol box, cold chain will be maintained. Tape the box completely and put the entire thing inside a bigger cardboard box. Once it is within the cardboard box, that is also sealed, labeled properly, fill up the ICMR form, put it inside another Ziploc bag and tape it to the surface of the cardboard box. The box should also be labeled so that it can be understood that it is carrying infective material. The viral transport media containing SARS-CoV-2 virus has been labeled as category B biological substance, which is of definite infective importance. And so since we don't want a biohazard occurring, it should be properly labeled so that it can be handled carefully. Finally, all samples must be kept at 4 degrees during transport. That is, rigid maintenance of the cold chain is mandatory. Now, maybe suppose, let us assume that due to some technical issues, the samples could not be transferred to the lab immediately. How long can we store the samples? Actually, it depends a lot on the sample type. Most samples can be kept from within 2 days to a maximum of 5 days at normal refrigeration temperatures, that is 2 degrees to 4 degrees. Whereas if you want to store the sample for a longer period of time and yet maintain the viability of the genetic material, that is the RNA, in that case, a minus 70-degree refrigeration is mandatory. If you don't follow this and you send your sample to the lab, it is more than likely that all you will get is a false negative result. So this is this last part, which I particularly want to emphasize on, samples must maintain the cold chain and they can be stored only for 2 to 4 days, 2 to 5 days at the normal refrigerators and thereafter at -70°C. This has to be stringently followed, otherwise they will simply result in a discarded or a damaged sample which will not yield a positive result. So this brings us to the end of the part 2, that is the sample collection, the sample transportation. So now we know whom to collect, how to pack, and how to send it to the lab while maintaining the cold chain. So now the most important part that remains, that is the actual diagnostic technologies in the lab. In the lab, there are quite a few methods, but we will divide them grossly into 2 parts. Number 1, the direct methods, in which we are directly searching for something of the virus. It might be visualizing the virus, it might be detecting the antigen of the virus, or it might be growing or culturing the virus, or it might be detecting the nucleic acid of the virus. And in the indirect methods, we don't directly have access to the virus. What we do is that we tend to search for evidence of infection. So that is actually an indirect method. We will discuss all the methods briefly, and the most important method, that is the nucleic acid detection, in much greater detail. So amongst the direct methods, as you can see, we have first and foremost electron microscopy. At the beginning of this webinar, I had, while discussing the morphology of SARS coronavirus, I had shared a picture of the coronavirus to you. That picture was taken by an electron microscope. An electron microscope is extremely efficient in visualizing the virus, but it is very, very cumbersome, very expensive, very difficult to handle, and thus it is not really very much of use in clinical diagnostics. For such a country like India, with a huge, dense population, thousands and lakhs of cases which are suspected COVID cases, lakhs of samples coming in every day, it is not really feasible to initiate electron microscopy as a method of diagnosis. So although it can be done, it is mainly done for research purposes and has limited use in clinical diagnostics. The next method is antigen detection. Now, the viral antigen can be detected by ELISA techniques or by immunofluorescence. What is ELISA? I think we all know, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, and by immunofluorescence. Now, recently, the company Biosensor has brought in a kit, which is the antigen detecting kit of SARS-CoV-2, which has been approved by ICMR. It is a monoclonal antibody-based kit, but there is a major drawback. Because of this monoclonal antibody, the chances of false negative it was seen was very high. So ICMR has approved it, but with a rider. What is the rider? That if you get a positive result, you can release the report as confirmatory. But if you get a negative report, you have to rerun the test by some other authorized or accredited methods. This makes it a very difficult test to perform on a regular basis. Because imagine if you have 1,000 samples a day, maybe out of that 20 or 30 will be positive, but all the rest will be negative. So if you have to rerun all of those, then what is the use of doing the antigen detection tests. So frankly, that is why, although this is an approved method, the biosensor kit is not yet available in the market, or it is because of this reason that the state governments have not yet allowed it to function or allowed it to it for testing methods in the labs. But definitely there such a technique exists. Now, the next method is viral culture. Viral culture inevitably is a very, very sensitive issue. This has to be done in active, usually continuous cell lines. They cannot be done in any routine labs. In fact, in India, initially, only the NIV Pune, that is the National Institute of Virology Pune, was carrying out this viral cell culture. You need a BSL-3 facility lab, which is a biosafety level 3, because here you are actually cultivating the virus, and the virus being such an infective virus. So this may be used for research purposes, this may be used for vaccine development, but for rapid diagnosis, this is again extremely cumbersome and not a recommended method. However, in cell cultures of cell lines such as Vero cell E6, then the monkey kidney cells, that is the non-primate kidney cells, it has been seen that the SARS-CoV-2 is giving a very good culture. They develop plaques. All viruses, when grown in cell culture, either develop plaques or pox. So they are growing very well, but again, it is a very difficult method. There is a high chance of outbreak of infection. So until and unless you have really very well equipped, as I said, a BSL 3 level facility, you should not venture into viral cell culture. And of course, it is, you can understand from that, so it is not the method for regular day-to-day testing for such a densely populated country like India. So this brings us to the last point on the direct testing methods, that is viral nucleic acid detection. This is done in case of SARS-CoV-2 by real-time reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction, that is the RT-PCR. And this testing is the backbone of COVID-19 detection, not only in India, but worldwide. I will come back to this particular method, and we will discuss this in complete detail of the principles involved, the types or the methodologies which are prevalent in India, their advantages, their disadvantages, everything. But first, I will just give a brief overview of the other testings. We have just completed the direct testing methods. Let me complete the indirect and the upcoming testing methods, and then we will come back to the RRT, the real-time reverse transcriptase PCR. So the indirect methods. The indirect methods, of course, the one which is of most importance is the antibody detection. This is such a test which has crossed a lot of a lot of concerns, a lot of queries, a lot of questionings all across the country, mainly detecting the IgM antibody and the IgG antibody by ELISA and by the rapid CAR tests, that is the immunochromatography or the IC methods. I have attached a graph. That is why I shared the screen. I hope the graph is clearly visible. We should know when which antibody comes into play. As long if you follow the blue line, that is the asymptomatic initially for the first 1 to 5 days when the patient is in the incubation period, that is the asymptomatic stage. Then the patient has onset of symptoms, becomes clinically significant. Then again, there is a decrease of the symptoms, that is the patient is slowly recovering or in the convalescent stage. And finally, there is disappearance of the symptoms. Now, the direct methods will help you to diagnose the virus when this blue line is at its peak. That is when the patient is having the clinical symptoms, then you can isolate the viral nucleic acid, then you can identify the antigen, then you can grow the virus from the patient sample. But once the patient is recovering, that is, the immune system of the body has started producing IgM antibodies. If you see the green line now, please follow the green line. That is the IgM. It comes into the circulation approximately on the day 7th and reaches a peak around day 14 and then again decreases to almost disappearing at around day 21. If you follow this green line, you will see that the more and more the IgM antibody starts coming in, the antigens is neutralized and the patient starts showing clinical improvement. That is, more the antibody level rises, the antigen or the virus load, the viral load in the patient will start decreasing. From day 14 onwards, approximately, of course, if you see the red curve, the third curve, the red curve is representing the IgG. As we all know, initially there is the IgM, and later on for long-term infectivity status indicator, we have the IgG. The immunoglobulin G comes on later in the disease when the patient is already improved, he is already recovering, and the IgM levels are also having a downfall. It is at that time that the IgG levels, please follow the red curve, IgG levels start rising and they reach a peak at around day 23, 24, and thereafter they remain in the circulation for a very, very long time. They might provide a long-term immunity, although that is not yet confirmed as of now. So therefore, of course, rapid testing can be done. It is of course of importance. It will help us, and we should know the exact timings when to do what test. So how does an antibody test help us? Let us have a quick look through the benefits of antibody testing. First and foremost, for epidemiological studies, we have to know the seroprevalence. The seroprevalence is what? It is the percentage of population who are carrying the antibody in their body. That is, who are maybe not immediately affected at that point of time, but who have been affected at some point of time or the other. So for determining seroprevalence, another very important advantage of antibody testing is the determining asymptomatic infection. We discussed a lot of symptoms at the beginning, but suppose the symptoms are not present. In India, as I said, a large percentage of population is coming out to be asymptomatic positive. In their cases, that is, they are testing for the antibody. So in their case, it helps us to identify the asymptomatic individuals. Then number 3, this helps us to identify the potential plasma donors. If we have been along with the COVID news, we must have seen that plasma therapy containing antibody-rich plasma was being transfused from a patient who has recovered to a patient who is in a critical condition. So by measuring the titers of antibody, if we are able to isolate and detect the patients rich in antibody, they can be identified as potential donors for the critically ill patient whose immune system is too weak to generate that level of antibody to fight the virus. And number 4, of course, any essential service workers, especially the healthcare workers who have been infected with the disease, if they do an antibody testing and find out that yes, they have antibody positive, they can be more or less assured that yes, we have recovered from the disease and we can go back to work. But of course, in spite of all this, antibody testing is not being done for diagnosis. Why? That is because of the issue of sensitivity and specificity. Also, although the kit which was developed by Roche, it gave a specificity of 100% and a sensitivity of 98%. That is, out of 100 samples, it would detect a SARS-CoV-2 in 98% cases, and in case of specificity was 100%. That is, those which it has detected in 100% cases, there will be SARS-CoV-2 by other means also. But the kits which were available in India, namely initially there were some Chinese kits, then there was some indigenous kits, their sensitivity and specificity was not found to be as good in quality, as their results were not tallying rather with the PCR results. Hence, they have been withdrawn from the market. They are not being used currently for diagnosis, but rather they are being used for seroprevalence studies and for epidemiological studies. So what is next? Next, we have the upcoming or the other tests which can be done. This includes the PRNT test. This is actually not an upcoming test. This is a very, very important test which has existed for a long time for lots of viruses. For COVID-19 also, this is important. This is the plaque reduction neutralization test. Just because I have an antibody, I should not be very happy and say, oh, I have an antibody, so I'm never going to get COVID again. That is not the case. We cannot confirm that whether a particular antibody is actually protective or not until and unless we have done a neutralization test. So what is a neutralization test? Again, it is actually a form of cell culture. There are different petri dishes with varocell layer or primate kidney cell layer, monolayers. These are just a monolayer of cells, and on it, in the different petri dishes, we add different concentrations, a rising titer of antibody. And we find out that at what concentration or what titer of antibody has the plaque, that is the viral growth, that is the, as I told you, when a virus grows, it grows in the form of a plaque or a pock. So at what point of time 50% of this plaque has been reduced or neutralized by the antibody. That is the PRNT50 value, and that helps us to determine that yes, not only is this antibody protective, but it is also protective at this particular titer. So if you see the picture on the right, that is the different petri dishes having cellular monolayer with SARS-CoV-2 being grown on it, and in different petri dishes, the a protective antibody in increasing titer has been added. So in those in which the plaque formation has been neutralized, in those cases, it can be assumed that yes, these are the protective antibodies, or this is the concentration or the titer of antibodies at which the virus can be neutralized. That is, actually the virus is no longer capable of infecting the cells. However, as all good things come with a rider, so this is also, since we are again doing a viral culture, this is very, very risky. It requires extreme technical expertise, and not only that, it requires again a BSL 3 level lab, that is a biosafety 3 level, which is not commonly available in every other diagnostic center in town. So this is only done in selected reference labs maybe, or research institutes, but not regular. Okay, what other tests? A few more tests that we can see. This includes the RT-LAMP, that is a reverse transcription loop mediated isothermal amplification and nanoparticle based technique for rapid COVID-19 detection. What is this? This is a very interesting thing. I will just tell a few things because this is a process being developed in University of Maryland, the Maryland Medical School in USA. And what is most interesting is that this is headed by a Bengali gentleman, Dr. Dipanjan Pan. So we have every reason to feel very proud. This method uses some gold particles, gold nanoparticles, which are capped, these are gold nanoparticles. It is capped with a specific nucleic acid, which is in target or which is complementary to the SARS-CoV-2 sequence. This is not yet approved by USA FDA, and it is still in the process, but it is recommended being talked about as one of the very dramatic things, since within 10 minutes, it will give you a result which you can actually see. The nanoparticles in the presence of SARS-CoV-2 virus will aggregate together and change the color of the solution tube from purple to blue. That is why it is a colorimetric test. Just imagine if you don't have to do any of such complicated tests, you don't have to do any PCR, you just put in the sample and within 10 minutes the color changes. Oh, so this is positive, it doesn't change, so this is negative. So this is definitely, it is a very, very interesting, also very interesting thing to note, and let us hope that it comes into the market very soon. Okay, I have the hematological assays also, because whatever laboratory diagnosis is, the clinical condition of a patient is of utmost importance. And I think the hematological assays are the most important factor in that count. So of course, there will be an increased neutrophil count, a decreased lymphocyte count. There might even be a lymphoerythroblastic crisis. There will be increased CRP protein levels, that is the C-reactive protein levels, as in any infection, increased ESR, increased liver enzymes like AST, ALT, gamma GP, alkaline phosphatase, increased lactate dehydrogenase. In severe cases, when the patient is not doing well, kidney parameters like urea, creatinine, blood urea nitrogen will rise. Cardiac parameters like CKMB, myoglobin, troponin will increase. The coagulation profile, especially in the terminal patients, may show a dramatic spike in D-dimer and prothrombin time. And of course, last but not the least, interleukin-6 levels will be greatly increased, especially in a patient who is experiencing a potential cytokine storm. We will just discuss in brief, what is a cytokine storm. It is basically a hyperimmune response seen in a subset of patients with COVID-19. What happens, usually all cytokines are under strict transcriptional and post-transcriptional mechanisms. They cannot be suddenly released into the body as and when they like. But due to some immune dysregulation, if the mechanism is disabled, this leads to a large flush of interleukins levels into the body. This causes a severe condition. It causes a tachycardia, flushing, fever, respiratory distress, and the patient turns critically ill. This condition, the hyperimmune phase, this has been quite commonly seen in quite a large subset of COVID-19 patients. This condition is the cytokine storm. In this condition, determining the IL-6 levels, the interleukin-6 level assay, is of profound importance. How can we do that? We can do it either by chemiluminescence. I think that is quite a feasible method available in many labs across the country, or we can also do it by ELISA. Why is it IL-6 so important? Because it has been seen that if we use interleukin-6 receptor antagonist drugs, that is, we block the IL-6 receptors, we don't allow that cytokine to act by using drugs like tocilizumab. In those cases, the patient is rapidly able to pull out of the cytokine storm. So this is a brief overview of all the other assays, the background assays, the diagnostic techniques that can be done for diagnosing COVID-19 in the lab. Now we come to the gold standard, and we will just discuss this briefly in details. That is the reverse transcriptase real-time PCR. This is the last part of our discussion today. As I already told, this is the gold standard method in India. ICMR has approved RT-PCR 3 variations through the open conventional method, through CBNAT, that is cartridge-based nucleic acid amplification test, and through TrueNAT technology. What are these? These are qualitative methodologies by which the target sequences of SARS-CoV-2 genome carrying the E gene, that is the envelope gene, that is the gene that is targeted for screening, or the RDRP gene, the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase gene for confirmation, the ORF1A or 2B, which are the subtypes of the RDRP gene, the other structural genes such as the S gene, the N gene, the E gene, all these can be identified. So, what is the principle of RT-PCR? There are two components. Initially, we will only focus on the reverse transcriptase PCR, and then we will go on to the real-time component. First and foremost, we know that corona SARS-CoV-2 virus is an RNA virus. So initially, with the help of a reverse transcriptase enzyme, we need to convert the RNA into a DNA, that is the complementary DNA. And then this DNA, following conventional PCR method, can be put into the thermal cycler and amplified, and we will put some real-time fluorescent probes into it as well. So the more and more viral nucleic acid amplicons are generated, we get more and more fluorescence, and thus we can detect, oh, so this has got such fluorescence, this is positive. No fluorescence has been generated, so this is negative. Let us see in details. So, first, we convert the sample RNA into the complementary DNA using the enzyme reverse transcriptase. Of course, we require the nucleotides and we require an oligo T primer, which will bind to the poly-RNA tail. Please look at the left-hand side of the slide. The left-hand side, please, the red one, where it is showing that you have the original RNA of the SARS-CoV virus, and the yellow is the oligonucleotide primer, which binds to the poly-A tail. The poly-A tail of the RNA, and with the help of the enzyme reverse transcriptase, it produces a cDNA, that is the complementary DNA. Then this complementary DNA will undergo amplification and proliferation like the proper PCR. Now you can look at the right side. What are the steps? Now that we have this cDNA, now we will denature the DNA strands by heat. So the template DNA bearing the target sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 will also get denatured. To that denatured sequence, the primer, now this is another primer. The primer is commercially available and it bears a sequence of nucleotides which is complementary to the target nucleic acid sequence. That is, in this case, it is complementary to the nucleic acid sequence of SARS-CoV-2. So the primer comes and binds, that is, there is annealing. Now in the presence of proper temperature, the presence of nucleotides, that is when the master mix has already been mixed and it has been put into the thermal cycler, more and more with the help of the DNA polymerase enzyme, more and more nucleotides will be added, and from one DNA, one double-stranded DNA, we will get 2 DNA. That is, from, as we know the principle of PCR. From there was initially RNA, from that we got a complementary DNA. Now this complementary DNA is initially separated, that is denatured, and after the primer binds to each of them, in the presence of DNA polymerase enzyme, the nucleotide keeps on adding in each in opposite directions, and so now from one double-stranded DNA we have 2 double-stranded DNA. These are only those, these are called the amplicons. These are only those which are bearing the target nucleic acid sequence. What is our target in this case? It is the nucleic acid sequence of SARS-CoV-2. I will just show it again. So at finally, this is only in one cycle. So at the end of one cycle, we have 2. At the end of 2 cycles, we have 4. Then we have 8. Sorry, we have 16. And it goes from one power to another power until at the very end, we have billions of copies. So finally, there will be billions of copies, and they are known as the amplicons. Now we come to the other part, that is the real-time part. How do we make it real-time? What is real-time? Real-time basically means that we don't have to wait till the end of PCR to see whether the band has come or not, whether it is positive or not. As the test is running simultaneously, we are getting a knowledge regarding the condition or regarding the positivity of the sample. How is this done? This is mainly done by including a fluorescent dye. That might be a dye, that might be a TaqMan probe, that might be a molecular beacon, that might be a scorpion probe. So these are usually the ones which are used. Cyber green dye is most economical and best to use because it immediately emits a light green fluorescence. But if we are more interested in quantification, in case of COVID, we don't go for quantification. But otherwise, in that case, if you are interested, we can go for a TaqMan probe. This is, I think it's not necessary to go into all the details, but this is just a very nice picture of a probe. As you can see, there are 2 globules or balls at 2 ends of the probe. One is the quencher molecule and the other is the fluorescence probe. When the quencher, see the tennis racket shaped, you know, the table tennis racket shaped structures above. If you see the molecules, when the quencher molecule is in close proximity with the probe, it does not allow the probe to emit any fluorescence. But when the probe comes and binds to the target sequence, and also the primer comes and binds to the target sequence, it causes the DNA to grow in size, and thus the probe and the quencher become further and further until finally they break from between. As they break, the effect of the quencher particle is lost and the fluorescence starts being emitted. That is immediately captured. The fluorescence is read by the real-time PCR machine. This brings us to the CT value or the cycle threshold value. What is the cycle threshold value? It is the number of cycles of which we have to do PCR in order to generate a sufficient fluorescence which can be detected. So if you see this graph, in real-time PCR assay, a positive reaction is detected by accumulation of the fluorescence cycle. The CT or the cycle threshold value is defined as the number of cycles required for the fluorescence signal to cross the threshold value. Of course, the last line is the most important. The CT values are inversely proportional to the amount of target nucleic acid in the sample. I will just explain this in a line. Say a patient has a very, very high load of virus in his body. So just within a few cycles of PCR, say around 10-15 cycles of PCR, already such a large amount of amplicons will have been generated that they will have emitted a very high level of fluorescence. So the curve, the fluorescence curve will be detected very early. That is, the CT value will be very low. The cycle threshold, the number of cycles will maybe say, take it for granted, for 40. Whereas in a patient who has a very low viral load in the body, in his case, the amplicons has to go on multiplying in several cycles, maybe until at around the 28th or the 30th cycle, maybe sufficient fluorescence will be generated to get, which will be, can be detected by the machine or to get the graph. So in their case, the CT value is very, very high. So although this is not a quantitative assay, CT value does provide us an approximate idea as to the viral load that the patient is carrying or that is there in the sample. Finally, this is in brief the PCR technique. All this can be done by either the manual method, that is in which the RNA is extracted separately, the master mix is prepared, is incubated manually, then the thing is put into the thermal cycler manually and then PCR is done, or it can be done in two automated methods, that is CBNAT and TrueNAT. What is CBNAT? CBNAT is a cartridge-based nucleic acid amplification test. If you look at the picture, this has been developed by Cepheid. Its machine is called GeneXpert, and there are cartridges and they are completely automated. You don't have to do anything. The main advantage is that one, it is so user-friendly, and two is that the turnaround time is very less. From receiving the sample to getting the results, it is just about say 40 minutes to 1 hour. The entire process of the decontamination of the sample, the extraction, the cellular lysis, the extraction of the nucleic acid, that is the elute, then preparing the master mix, incubating it, denaturation, annealing, amplification, everything is done by the machine itself. So also this is very important because, for example, in a hospital setting, like I am speaking from a hospital, there are lots of patients. In case there is a breach in infection control, when we are manually doing all the steps, it might lead to a grave outbreak within the hospital. So if we go for an automated technique like CBNAT, obviously it is much easier, and that is why ICMR has approved it, and it is now being widely used all over the country. Finally, the last we come to the TrueNAT. This has recently been developed by a company called MolBio. It is an indigenous company. It is a chip-based real-time reverse transcriptase PCR for qualitative and semi-quantitative detection of SARS-CoV-2. Initially, ICMR had said that this can only be done as a screening test. That is, you can only test for the E gene. If it is negative, we can release a negative report. But if it is positive, it has to be reconfirmed by either the conventional open PCR or by CBNAT. But just at the beginning of June, a few weeks back, ICMR released a second circulatory in which it said that if in TrueNAT we run for those which are coming positive for the E gene, that is the envelope gene, if we run this positive samples a second time for the RDRP gene, and if it again comes positive, then we can take it as confirmatory. Personally, in West Bengal, from where I'm speaking, a very large number of government hospitals are using this MolBio company's TrueNAT machine, mainly because this is very, very sturdy. It does not require a biosafety level 2 lab. It does not require AC. It does not require a biosafety cabinet, to the extent it does not even require electricity. It can even run on batteries. So with time, I think more and more methods will be determined. As you can see in the picture, this is a picture of the MolBio TrueNAT machine. Also, this has a very fast turnaround time, just around 40 minutes to 1 hour. And this has again made this a widely approved method in our country. So this was today's discussion. I thank Dr. Arijit from Polymed. I thank Sulagna for handling all my tantrums regarding the setting up of this webinar. And a very big thank you to Polymed to give me an opportunity to speak in this platform. I hope that it was lucid and understandable to all of you. And I definitely hope to get another such opportunity in the future. Good evening. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was really a pleasure listening to you. As if, you know, after the session, I feel that I'm quite comfortable at least understanding many of the news and articles which are coming today. So during the sessions while you were presenting, there were one question which had come, and I also kept noting down some of the areas where I would request you to, give your thoughts. One
Yeah.
question which one of the participants asked was that why nasopharyngeal swab is taken first and then followed by the oropharyngeal swab. Is there a sequence?
Actually, this is basically according to protocol or guidelines. Initially, CDC and WHO, if you look up the guidelines, had both said that nasopharyngeal swab was sufficient. And only in the absence of nasopharyngeal swab, say in a patient who has a Ryle's tube inserted, a patient who has a nasal tumor, only in their cases you can go forward and take the oropharyngeal swab. So oropharyngeal swab is actually of lesser importance when it comes to nasopharyngeal swab. So of course, a first try always will be to get a proper nasopharyngeal swab. Nowadays, we take both within the VTM so that, we have a higher concentration of virus within the medium so that we can extract it easier.
Right, ma'am. Uh, Another question, one of the reports that came in maybe about 15, 20, or maybe a month back, I do not recall, was that that there are 10 strains, there are 10 serotypes which are prevalent in India or the subcontinent maybe. So when these molecular testing or maybe a reverse transcriptase or an antibody antigen based tests are designed, so how difficult it is to arrive at a conclusive diagnosis because you're dealing with 10 different types of
Yes, I
strains.
get your question. See, if you followed the lecture, you would have seen that like I had particularly mentioned two genes repeatedly. One is the E gene for screening, and the other one is the RDRP gene,
RDRP.
that is the
Yeah.
RNA dependent RNA polymerase gene. Now these are intrinsic genes. How much ever mutation you undergo, how much ever changes, how many phenotypes, how many strains may develop, these genes cannot change. These are the structural genes. The E gene stands for the envelope genes. So, like if the envelope of the virus is destroyed, then of course, then the virus is non-pathogenic. The virus does not live anymore. It's a dead virus. So that is
Right.
why, we are using for disinfection all this, lipid, alcohol sanitizers. Why? Because alcohol is dissolving the lipid envelope. It is
Right.
destroying. In that case, if the E gene or the RDRP gene is not present, if the RNA polymerase gene, like, RNA dependent RNA polymerase is mandatory for the virus to synthesize its genome. If
Right.
these two genes are not present, forget about all the other, like, of course, we don't know when we are testing in the lab, we are not routinely testing for the different phenotypes or the serotypes. We are not testing. We don't know the strains. For that, we require a higher level of testing. For clinical diagnosis, for day to day, I have 1,000 patients, I have to report their status tomorrow. For them, E gene and RDRP gene is sufficient. Maybe along other structural genes like, S gene, E gene, etc.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. That's clarity around that. Another point which you spoke about was PRNT test, and it's almost like a confirmatory test whether the antibody is protective or not at this point in time. We talk about reports of success of plasma therapy from convalescent sera. So, is PRNT test used to check whether this particular plasma is going to be beneficial for the recipient?
Absolutely. In fact, like for this PRNT, like just before this COVID broke out, there was an outbreak of Ebola. There was outbreak of Zika in different parts, especially in Africa. Everywhere, PRNT test is done to actually know how protective your antibody is. Even like randomly transmitting plasma, we have to know whether that's IgM or that IgG is actually going to help prevent or neutralize the virus and prevent them from infecting further cells on it. PRNT test is of utmost importance. Without a neutralization test, we cannot be 100% sure that yes, this particular antibody is definitely protective for me and I'm not going to develop COVID anymore.
Right. There is already a question regarding the incubation period. I think you have already covered that it spreads between 2 and 12 days. The median sits between 5 and 6 days, somewhere there.
Exactly.
Yeah. And a couple of last two. One is about cytokine storm. You said that there are specific medications which can sort of stop unleashing of this IL-6. Recently, very recently, we hear a lot about dexamethasone, our old friend. So we hear about them. That's quite, a generic drug, and it's available, can be produced at large scales. So for critically ill patients, we have another weapon in the arsenal.
Yes, but definitely it will help. Actually, ever since the beginning, the treatment protocol of COVID patient is also evolving. As I said, this is a newborn disease. We don't know anything confirmed about this, neither the natural history, nor everything is changing. So initially, steroids were used in some parts of the world. But then again, they said that no, already the people like diabetics, cancer patients, elderly patients were contracting the virus whose immune system were already weakened. So with more steroid therapy, they were maybe recovering from the cytokine storm, but they were acquiring hospital-acquired infection, maybe a bacterial septicemia, maybe a urinary tract infection, maybe from their IV line or cannula, maybe a blood septicemia. So in those cases, so then the Western countries did not really prefer the steroid therapy. But again, since we have tocilizumab, which acts very specifically, IL receptor antagonist, but I must say that tocilizumab is really, it is extremely expensive. I think around 60,000 for one vial or something like that. So it is actually beyond the reach. So even now, a person who is in a cytokine storm will have to be treated with supportive management, and that will include steroids.
There is a question which has just now come up, is that during plasma therapy, is there a possibility that we are generating potential antibodies towards the antibodies, so in the future?
Yes. See, we don't directly take the whole blood of the donor and put it into the patient. Usually the antigens are carried by the RBCs. So when we are talking of plasma, the RBCs are automatically removed from the samples. Usually antibodies, just the IgM or the IgGs, do not trigger such, this is not a case of a graft versus host disease or some such situations don't come in. Usually, because the cells are washed, then when we are extracting the plasma, automatically all the maximum cellular factors and lots of other proteins are also washed away from the sample. So the remaining is usually not likely to trigger foreign body reaction. And even if it does, again, this is under evaluation, I must say, usually these are not given routinely. They are given to a patient who is already so critical that, any thing which works, they are ready to take the risk.
Absolutely. The very last question, real-time RT-PCR, how expensive it is. I mean, we know the merits of that thing. We know that, and something which is coming up by Dr. Anjan Pan, amazing 10 minutes, quick confirmatory tests. Then with the current technology, RT-PCR, what is the cost for each such test?
Do you mean the cost of the machine or for the costs of the tests on the patients?
On the patient.
On the patient, CVNAT was around 4,500. That has been fixed by the ICMR.
Okay.
But even then, I think CVNet within less than 5,000 is quite difficult for corporates to, like for government, maybe there is a lot of other facilities, but for the corporate houses, 4,500 is pretty difficult. And TrueNat is significantly cheaper. TrueNat is significantly cheaper. I think I am not very sure, but it is less than 2,000.
Okay.
Which is why, you know, like TrueNat is being greatly encouraged. And when you go for an open conventional RRT-PCR, then of course, you know, the manual thing and everything comes into play. Then also, you know, like it is no profit zone for the corporates less than 5,000. That is why, in fact, TrueNat, in spite of having, you know, like some non-specificities, that is why it is so much in demand. It is quite accurate and quite cheap.
Thank you so much. Thank you for answering all the questions from the participants as from my side. And it was wonderful listening to you throughout. We have recorded your session. We have recorded the session as well, so that in you know, we can, you know, disseminate it to others who may benefit from your session.
You are most welcome to do so. Okay,
thank you so much. Thank you once again. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks all my viewers.
Yeah. Bye-bye.